The streets of New York were alive with their usual chaos, honking cabs, hurried footsteps, voices blending into the city's endless symphony. But amidst the rush, outside a dimly lit boxing gym, stood a small boy, barely 10 years old, staring through the glass like he was looking at another world. Inside, fighters moved like warriors, punches snapping against heavy bags, trainers barking instructions, the scent of sweat and determination thick in the air. The boy's fingers pressed against the cold window, his breath fogging the glass like a kid outside a toy store with no money, staring at the one thing he wanted more than anything. He didn't notice the tall figure approaching from the side, didn't see the shadow that loomed over him until a deep, unmistakable voice broke through the noise. "You like boxing, kid?" The boy froze. Because that voice? That was Mike Tyson. And from this moment on, his life would never be the same. The city moved fast, but for the small boy standing outside the boxing gym, time had slowed to a crawl. His eyes stayed locked on the fighters inside, his little fists clenching involuntarily every time someone landed a clean punch on the heavy bag. He wasn't just watching. He was studying. He barely noticed the chill in the air, the soreness in his feet from standing too long, the way people passed him without a second glance. All that mattered was what was happening beyond that glass. And then, the voice. "You like boxing, kid?" It was deep, unmistakable. The kind of voice that carried weight even in a city full of noise. The boy blinked, turning his head slowly, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing next to him, hands in the pockets of a sleek black jacket, was Mike Tyson. The Mike Tyson. And he was looking right at him. The boy had spent countless evenings standing in front of that gym, staring through the window, watching every movement inside like a student desperate to learn but unable to step into the classroom. He knew every fighter by how they moved, memorized the way they threw their punches, the rhythm of their footwork, the expressions on their faces when they pushed through exhaustion. But he wasn't just watching for fun. He was watching because he wanted to be one of them. He had wanted it for as long as he could remember, but the reality of his world had always been a cruel reminder that some dreams were too expensive. He had seen the older kids, the ones with money, walk into that gym, laughing, tossing their gloves over their shoulders, talking about sparring rounds and training sessions. And every time he saw them walk in, he felt like an outsider to a world he belonged to in his heart, but not in his reality. Until now. Until this moment. Because now, Mike Tyson was standing next to him, asking him questions, treating him like someone who mattered. And that was more unbelievable than any championship fight. "Yeah," the boy finally said, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be, his throat suddenly dry, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear, but everything to do with the weight of the moment. Mike Tyson stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses, but there was something in his posture, something in the way he tilted his head slightly, that made the boy feel like this was more than just small talk. Mike wasn't just asking. He was paying attention. "You ever been in there?" The boy's fingers clenched slightly at the question, his hands instinctively balling into small fists at his sides. He had waited years for someone to ask him that, to acknowledge what he felt every time he stood outside that door. And now, the greatest boxer of all time was asking it. "Nah. I just watch," the boy finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it out loud made it more real, more painful, more permanent. Mike didn't react right away. Didn't say anything. Just stood there, letting the words settle, letting the truth of them fill the space between them. And the boy hated it. Because the silence made it worse. Because it made it feel like something was missing inside him, like something was broken, like there was something wrong with him for wanting something he couldn't reach. "Why don't you go inside?" It was such a simple question. But to the boy, it felt like someone asking why he didn't have wings. Because to him, walking into that gym wasn't an option. It had never been an option. The boy wanted to lie. Wanted to make up some excuse. Wanted to say anything other than the truth, because the truth wasn't just embarrassing, it hurt. But there was something about Mike Tyson standing in front of him, something about the way he looked at him with complete focus, something about the way his presence filled the space without effort, without force, without intimidation, that made the boy feel like he couldn't say anything but the truth. Can't afford it. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and for a second, he wished he could take them back, wished he could pretend like it didn't bother him, like it wasn't the thing that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, dreaming about a ring he'd never step into. But it was too late. Mike had heard them. And for the first time, Mike Tyson wasn't just looking at a kid, he was looking at himself. Mike knew that voice, knew that tone, knew that feeling of wanting something so bad it hurt, of dreaming about something that felt impossible, of standing outside a world that should have been his, but feeling like the door was permanently locked. Because he had been this kid once. Not just any kid, this exact kind of kid. A kid who had stood outside gyms, too poor to step inside. A kid who had watched fighters and tried to memorize their movements because training wasn't an option. A kid who had learned how to throw punches in the streets before he ever had a pair of gloves on his hands. A kid who had been ignored, overlooked, dismissed, until one person saw something in him and changed everything. And now, Mike was standing on the other side of that moment. Now, he was the one who had the power to change everything for someone else. And he wasn't about to let this kid keep standing outside a place where he belonged. Mike turned back to the gym, staring through the glass. He had trained here before. He knew the place. He knew the owner. And he knew damn well that money was the only thing standing between this kid and a shot at his dream. And that was something Mike could fix. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the entrance. The boy's entire body tensed. "Inside? Yeah, man. You can't learn boxing through a window." The boy's breath caught in his throat. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Had pictured himself walking through that door, stepping onto the mats, feeling the weight of real gloves on his hands. But never, not even in his wildest dreams, did he imagine that the person bringing him inside would be Mike Tyson. For a second, the boy couldn't move. Because this didn't feel real. Because dreams didn't come true like this. Because he had spent so long believing he wasn't allowed in, that now, with the door wide open, with Mike Tyson waiting for him, with a chance in front of him, he was afraid to take it. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he stepped inside and they all laughed? What if he put on gloves and it turned out he wasn't built for this at all? Mike seemed to sense the hesitation. And instead of rushing him, instead of pushing him, he just waited. Waited for the boy to decide. Because this wasn't about Mike. This was about the boy choosing himself. The boy swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. One step. Then another. And then he was inside. For the first time. For the first real time. And the moment his feet touched the mats, he knew. Knew this was where he was meant to be. Knew this wasn't just a dream anymore. Knew that from this second forward, everything was about to change. The moment the boy stepped inside the gym, it felt like he had crossed an invisible barrier, one that had existed in his mind for as long as he could remember, one that had kept him outside looking in, making him believe that the world of fighters, of champions, of men who walked with unshakable confidence, was a place he could never truly belong. The air inside was thick with the scent of sweat, leather, and chalk, a mixture that might have made others turn away, but for the boy, it smelled like possibility, like hunger, like something real. The walls were lined with old posters of legendary fighters, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Sugar Ray Leonard, faces frozen in time, forever young, forever immortal, forever reminders that greatness wasn't just about talent but about heart, about resilience, about the kind of fight that had nothing to do with punches and everything to do with refusing to quit. And as he stood there, his feet planted on the worn mat, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides, he realized something he had never let himself believe before. He was inside. He had made it. And for the first time, he wasn't just watching. The boy had expected to go unnoticed, to slip into the background, to blend in like just another kid who had wandered in off the street. But this wasn't just any moment. Because he wasn't just walking into the gym. He was walking in with Mike Tyson. And that didn't go unnoticed by anyone. The sound of speed bags bouncing off leather slowed. The rhythmic pounding of gloves against heavy bags became less frequent. The chatter between fighters softened as heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers spread like wildfire. Because when Mike Tyson walks into a boxing gym, people pay attention. And when he walks in with a kid no one has ever seen before, people start asking questions. From across the gym, a man with graying hair, arms crossed over his chest, watched the scene unfold with the kind of expression that said he had seen 1,000 kids come and go, kids with big dreams and small discipline, kids who thought boxing was all about swinging fists but had no idea about the pain, the work, the suffering it took to actually be great. He was the head coach, the one who ran this gym, the one who decided who belonged and who didn't, the one who had trained champions and had sent just as many hopefuls home, telling them to find another dream because this one wasn't for them. And now he was watching this kid, standing stiff and uncertain, looking like he wanted to disappear and take up all the space in the world at the same time. Mike Tyson noticed the coach watching. And without breaking stride, he walked the boy straight toward him. "Got a new fighter for you," Mike said, his voice casual, like he was talking about the weather, like this was just another day, just another kid, nothing special, except it wasn't. The coach raised an eyebrow, looking the boy up and down. "That so?" The boy felt his throat tighten. Because in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about stepping inside the gym. This was about proving he belonged. And if he thought getting through the door was hard, that was nothing compared to what was coming next. The coach's gaze was like an X-ray, cutting straight through any nerves, any excitement, any illusions. He had seen too many kids walk in full of fire only to leave broken, too many dreamers who thought boxing was about power but didn't understand that it was more about pain, about patience, about being willing to get back up every single time you got knocked down. And looking at this boy now, small, skinny, with hands that had never been inside gloves before, he wasn't convinced. "Kid ever throw a punch?" the coach asked, glancing at Mike. Mike smirked. "Not yet." The coach let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Then what makes you think he's got what it takes?" And before the boy could feel discouraged, before doubt could creep in, Mike Tyson turned to him with the same look of certainty he had worn inside the ring his whole career. "Because I see it." And just like that, the conversation was over. Because when Mike Tyson says he sees something in you, you don't argue. The coach sighed, walking over to a rack lined with old, battered boxing gloves, grabbing a pair that looked too big for the boy's small hands. "Fine. Let's see what he's got." The boy could barely breathe as the gloves were tossed to him. They felt heavier than he expected, more real, more important, like something sacred had been placed in his hands, like something that carried history, weight, responsibility. And in that moment, as he slid his fingers inside, as he tightened the straps, as the leather pressed against his skin, it hit him. This wasn't just about today. This wasn't just about throwing a few punches. This was the start of something bigger. "Come on, kid. Let's see what you got." The coach stood in front of him now, holding up a pair of padded mitts, waiting, expecting, watching. The boy swallowed, feeling the weight of every eye in the gym on him. Mike Tyson was watching. The fighters were watching. The coach was waiting. And now it was his turn to do something. "Go on," Mike said, voice low, steady, firm. "Hit it." The boy hesitated. Then, drawing in a breath, he threw his first punch. It wasn't strong. It wasn't clean. But it was real. And the second he felt the impact, the second he heard the soft pop of leather against the mitt, something inside him clicked into place. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was doing it. Again. The boy blinked, looking up at the coach. "What?" "Again." So he threw another punch, then another, and another. And before he knew it, before he could second guess himself, before doubt could creep back in, he was hitting the mitts like he had always meant to be here. Like this was who he was meant to be. And Mike was watching, smiling, because he had been right. The coach lowered the mitts, steadying the kid for a long moment, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then, finally, he's got something. And that was all the confirmation Mike needed. Because now, this kid wasn't just some boy standing outside a gym. Now, he was a fighter. The boy looked up at Mike, breathless, hands still shaking inside the gloves. What now? Mike grinned. Now, he said. Now, you train. And from that moment forward, nothing would ever be the same. The boy could still feel the sting of his last punch vibrating through his gloves, the satisfying thud of leather against the mitts, the way the impact felt more like a statement than just a movement. He had spent years watching from the outside, convincing himself that this world was just out of reach, that it belonged to others, to kids with money, to kids who had fathers that could sign them up for classes, to kids who didn't have to dream from a distance. And yet, here he was. Not on the outside. Not looking through the glass. But inside. Inside a real boxing gym. Inside a space where champions were made. Inside a moment that already felt like it had changed him forever. He had been too focused to realize it before, too locked into his punches, too caught up in the rhythm of the moment, but now, as he pulled back from the mitts, catching his breath, he felt it, the weight of the room, the shift in attention, the way the other fighters had stopped what they were doing and were now watching him, some leaning against the ropes, some resting their hands on heavy bags, their expressions a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and something else. Something that made his stomach tighten. Something that made his heart pound a little harder. Respect. Not much of it. Not yet. But just enough to make him feel like, for the first time in his life, he was being seen as more than just a kid with a dream. The boy turned back toward the coach, still gripping the gloves tightly, still feeling the phantom sensation of impact in his knuckles, still riding the high of what had just happened. The coach steadied him for a long moment, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, like he was mentally measuring something, calculating something beyond just the punches the boy had thrown. "You're not bad," the coach finally muttered. "But hitting mitts ain't fighting." The boy swallowed hard. Because he already knew what was coming next. Because every fighter in the gym knew what came next. And Mike was still watching, still waiting, his expression cool, confident, like he already knew what was going to happen. There were rules in boxing that weren't written down. Rules that every fighter just knew. And the biggest one? You didn't earn respect with words. You didn't earn it with stories. You didn't earn it by showing up and saying you wanted to be great. You earned it in the ring. And that was where the boy was heading next. The boy barely had time to process what was happening before someone handed him a mouthpiece, before the coach gestured toward the ring, before the weight of the moment fully sank in. His heart started racing. Not out of fear. Not out of doubt. But because this was happening. Because this was real. Because this was the moment that would decide whether he was just some kid trying to box, or whether he actually belonged here. And as he climbed up onto the apron, gripping the ropes, pulling himself into the ring, he realized something. He had never wanted anything more in his life. The coach hadn't thrown him in against some beginner. Hadn't paired him up with another kid who was just learning. No. The boy's opponent was taller, stronger, a teenager with at least 3 years of training, someone who had already won amateur fights, someone who had the experience, the skill, the confidence to make sure this wasn't going to be easy. And that was the point. This wasn't just about testing skill. This was about testing heart. And Mike was leaning against the ropes, watching closely, arms crossed, his expression still unreadable. Because he had been here before. because he knew exactly what was about to happen. The boy barely had time to steady himself before the bell rang, before his opponent came at him fast, before he realized that watching boxing and actually doing it were two completely different things. He threw up his hands, tried to move, tried to remember everything he had seen, everything he had studied, everything he had just felt when he was hitting the mitts. But none of it prepared him for the first punch that landed. It wasn't hard enough to knock him down, but it was enough. Enough to make his head snap back slightly. Enough to make his chest tighten. Enough to make him feel, for the first time, what it really meant to be inside a fight. For a second, everything slowed down. He could hear his opponent moving, shifting his weight, already preparing to throw another punch. He could hear the murmurs from the other fighters, the quiet commentary that always came with moments like these, the bets being made, the predictions being whispered. And most of all, he could hear the doubt. Not from them. From himself. Because this was the moment. This was the part where Kid realized he didn't have what it took. This was the part where the dream ended. This was the part where he quit. But then he heard Mike. Breathe, kid. Move. Not a yell. Not a demand. Just a simple reminder. And in that moment, everything changed. The boy exhaled sharply, resetting his stance, remembering the way he had thrown his punches before, feeling the weight of the gloves, the balance in his feet. And then he moved. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. But with purpose. He dodged. And when his opponent missed, he threw a punch. And for the first time in his life, it landed. Not clean. Not hard. But it landed. And that was all he needed. The round ended before he knew it, the bell ringing out, signaling a pause, signaling the moment the fight stopped. But the boy, he didn't feel finished. Because he had survived. Because he hadn't backed down. Because he had just taken his first step towards something far bigger than he could have imagined. And as he pulled out his mouthpiece, breathing hard, sweat dripping down his face, he turned toward Mike, the man who had brought him here, the man who had believed in him before he had even thrown a punch, the man who was watching him now with something different in his eyes. Pride. Because now, this boy wasn't just some kid standing outside a boxing gym. Now, he was a fighter. As the boy stood in the center of the ring, his chest rising and falling with every deep breath he took, the sounds of the gym that had once felt distant and untouchable now surrounded him completely. Trainers shouting instructions at their fighters, the rhythmic pounding of jump ropes hitting the canvas floor, the steady thudding of gloved fists striking heavy bags in the background. Yet none of it seemed as loud as the racing thoughts in his own mind, thoughts that screamed at him that he had just survived his very first round of boxing, that he had felt the weight of an opponent's punch, that he had thrown his own shot and landed it, that he had tasted the reality of being inside a fight, and, despite every doubt that had clawed at his mind moments before, despite the fear that had almost paralyzed him when he stepped between the ropes, he was still standing. He had not run, he had not broken, he had fought back, and that, more than anything, was what separated those who only dreamed from those who actually fought to make those dreams real. As the boy turned toward the corner where Mike Tyson stood leaning against the ropes, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression partially hidden behind the dim lighting of the gym, there was something in his posture, in the way he observed the boy without speaking, that made it clear he had seen everything he needed to see in that first round, because Mike, more than anyone else in that building, knew that the heart of a fighter wasn't measured by strength or technique alone, but by the ability to take a hit, to feel pain, to have every instinct scream at you to stop, to leave, to find an easier way, and yet still make the decision to keep going. And the fact that this boy, small and inexperienced, had stayed in the ring, had pushed through the fear, had refused to crumble under the pressure, was something that Tyson understood on a level deeper than words could ever express. And so, instead of saying anything at all, instead of offering advice or empty praise, instead of making a big show of the moment, Mike simply nodded once, slowly, deliberately, a silent acknowledgement, a warrior's way of telling another that they had earned their place. And for the boy, that one small gesture meant more than 1,000 words ever could. Across the ring, the older fighter who had just sparred with the boy, the one who had walked into this match expecting to dominate, expecting to overwhelm a kid who had never even worn gloves before today, expecting to teach a hard lesson about how boxing wasn't for everyone, now stood with a slightly furrowed brow, adjusting his headgear, rolling his shoulders, shaking out his arms, not in frustration, not in anger, but in recognition of something he had not anticipated, something that had become undeniably clear by the end of that round. This boy wasn't weak. This boy wasn't someone who would quit. This boy wasn't just another kid who would step into the gym, take one punch, and leave forever, because he had taken real shots, had absorbed them, had processed them, had felt them, and yet he was still standing, still staring back, still ready for more. And that demanded respect. The bell hadn't rung yet, the air between rounds still thick with unspoken tension, the boy still trying to regulate his breathing, still shaking out the sting in his arms, still absorbing the sheer reality of where he was and what he was doing. But deep down, in the part of him that had always dreamed of this moment, he knew that the second round wasn't about winning, wasn't about proving that he was stronger, wasn't even about outboxing his opponent. It was about showing that he had the will to keep going, that he wasn't afraid anymore, that he could take everything this gym had to throw at him and still stand tall when it was over. And then, just as his heartbeat slowed to a steady rhythm, just as the world outside the ring faded into background noise, the sharp clang of the bell echoed through the gym. Round 2 had begun. This time, the boy didn't wait for his opponent to come to him, didn't freeze up, didn't hesitate, because something inside him had shifted, something had clicked into place, something had been ignited deep within him. And so, instead of being purely defensive, instead of just reacting, he stepped forward. His feet moved faster. His hands came up quicker. And for the first time, he wasn't just trying to survive, he was fighting. His opponent, bigger, stronger, more experienced, threw a quick jab, testing him, expecting him to flinch, expecting him to back away, but this time, he didn't. This time, he moved, just enough, just slightly, just perfectly, so that the punch whizzed past him without making contact, so that he could feel the rush of air from the force of the shot, but not the pain of it landing. And in that split second, as the realization hit him that he had just successfully dodged his first real punch in a fight, something inside him exploded with adrenaline. He didn't even think. Didn't plan it. Didn't calculate it. He just reacted. The moment his opponent missed, the moment that opening revealed itself, he threw a right hand, not the hardest punch, not the most technical, not the kind that knocked someone down, but the kind that landed clean, the kind that made people pay attention, the kind that made even the coach raise an eyebrow slightly in interest. And when the punch connected, the boy saw something in his opponent's eyes that he hadn't seen before. Recognition. This wasn't just a fluke. This wasn't just luck. This was real. For a moment, everything stopped. The entire gym seemed to pause, as if they had all been holding their breath, watching, waiting, wondering if this kid, this small, inexperienced, untrained kid, could actually prove that he belonged here. And now, there was no question anymore. Because he had done it. The round ended, the bell rang, the fight was over, and the boy stood there, panting, sweating, feeling every inch of exhaustion settle into his body, and yet, despite the aching in his muscles, despite the pounding in his head, he had never felt more alive. And as he turned toward the coach, waiting, hoping, desperately searching for some kind of reaction, for some kind of verdict, the coach let out a short breath and muttered, "Not bad, kid." And that meant everything. As the boy stepped out of the ring, unwrapping his gloves, still processing everything that had just happened, Mike Tyson clapped a hand on his shoulder, leaned down, and said with a quiet, knowing smirk, "Told you." Because he had known from the start. And now, so did everyone else. The boy sat on the edge of the ring, his hand still slightly shaking as he unwrapped the gloves, his body exhausted but his mind running a mile a minute, replaying every punch, every movement, every second of the fight in his head like a film he never wanted to forget. He could still hear the sounds of the gym around him, trainers shouting, jump ropes snapping against the floor, the rhythmic pounding of gloves hitting bags, but now, those sounds felt different, less distant, less like something he was watching from the outside, and more like something he was truly a part of. Mike Tyson sat beside him, watching him with that same knowing smirk, the kind that said, "Now you get it, don't you?" There was no grand speech, no moment of over-the-top encouragement, just a simple truth that hung between them. This was only the beginning. "You coming back tomorrow?" Mike finally asked. The boy, still catching his breath, looked up, his face drenched in sweat, his muscles aching, his body screaming for rest. And yet, there was no hesitation in his answer. Yeah. Because after today, there was no way he was walking away. Boxing had always been more than just a sport. It was a test, a proving ground, a battlefield where people discovered not just how hard they could hit, but how much they could endure, how deep they could dig, how much heart they truly had when it mattered most. And on this day, in a gym full of seasoned fighters, with the greatest heavyweight champion in history watching over him, one boy had stepped into that ring as a dreamer and walked out as something more. Mike Tyson had seen something in him long before the boy had seen it in himself, had opened a door that had always been locked, had given him a chance to fight for something real. But the truth was, nobody could make him a fighter. He had to prove it himself. And today, he had.